The studio is always looked upon as a safe place of sorts for creators. No matter what instrument a musician plays, all that internal drama of the music world seems to fall away to nothing when you put them behind a glass wall and let them bare their soul. However, recording sessions don't always unfold the way they were intended to. Throughout pop music's experience, there have been many albums that had some more, you might say, unusual developments. Whether from drugs, death, or just the dangerous rock and roll lifestyle, these albums came together from some of the most unusual circumstances. These are the strange tales from the artist's time woodshedding their best work into finely tuned gems. The albums may have sold in droves, but there were certainly a few bumps in the road along the way. With that in mind, I'm Will for WhatCulture, and here are 9 albums with creepy recording stories. 9. Hard Promises, Tom Petty. After weathering through a tumultuous lawsuit for his creative freedom, Tom Petty seemed a bit burnt out on the turbulent world of rock. Then again, that didn't deter him from putting out another fine piece of heartland rock on the record Hard Promises. Though there were many highlights from the sessions, like appearances by Stevie Nicks and Donald Duck Dunn, the most extravagant guest was unexpectedly left absent. About midway through producing, producer Jimmy Levine called up John Lennon, who he had worked with on previous records. Upon hearing where the Heartbreakers were recording, Lennon got in touch with Levine again and told him that he planned to come and visit the group in the studio and maybe even help out on a few tracks. This meeting of rock gods, however, was not meant to be, as Lennon was killed in December of 1980, just before he was set to book a flight to LA. Still reeling from the grief, Petty decided to print the first copies of the record with a sentimental twist to immortalize his idol. For those fans who bought the first copies of the record, there is a visible etching in the vinyl that proudly says, "We love you, JL," putting Lennon at the center of one of the band's greatest albums. 8. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Elton John. Feeling that he had fallen into a holding pattern with recording tactics, Elton John took his band and songwriter to a studio in Jamaica to work on Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. From the very start, the sessions came to a halt because of the lax production values present at the studio. The band couldn't even find a way to mic any of their instruments properly due to the shoddy equipment made available. To add insult to injury, Jamaica was also under a lot of political tension because of a recent economic scare, which led to outward violence in the streets. Quickly abandoning the concept, John and his band moved out of the facilities, with John fearing that he would be killed before he even boarded the plane. Luckily, the band found an even more prestigious studio place once they settled in a chateau in France. From there, the record hits from the title track to Candle in the Wind seem to generate themselves via osmosis. Though it may be a modern classic of the pop rock genre, John had to go through hell before it was fully realized. 7. The Doors, self-titled. The Doors' debut album was a watershed moment for the rock genre as a whole. Not only did it introduce the more psychedelic side of rock to the mainstream, but it also showed the world the captivating presence of Jim Morrison. At the same time, the band's experimentation with drugs led to lots of strange extracurricular activities. While the band was taking a day off from recording, Morrison had taken acid in his home and then felt the urge to venture to the studio, thinking he'd forgotten something. When he got there, he broke into the main room to find a single red recording light glowing in the control room. Still tripping, Morrison sprung into action, thinking the light was a fire he had accidentally lit. Within seconds, the entire studio floor was covered with water and fluid from a fire extinguisher. Quickly realizing what he'd done, Morrison ran back to his car, climbing over the wall of the studio. Even though he was able to sneak past the bigwigs of the studio for a few days, he was eventually caught when one of his shoes was found still dangling at the bottom of the studio wall. Rock and roll, ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll. 6. Francis the Mute, the Mars Volta. While the Mars Volta released a masterpiece with their debut Deloused in the Comatorium, things took a darker turn once they started to compile material for their next project. Just before recording began, longtime contributor Jeremy Ward passed away to a heroin overdose. With Ward's demise still weighing heavy on their minds, the band soldiered on with the project, choosing to make it in memory of their fallen friend. The whole album flows as a concept record of sorts, detailing the life of a man trying to come to grips with his mortality in the drug-fueled underground world he lives in. Though the album transcends any one genre, the overarching theme behind the record does seem to have the spirit of Ward present across the board. 5. Sgt. Pepper's The Beatles. Once the Beatles had come off one of the most strenuous tours of their career, the band decided to spend the rest of their time in the studio creating the most inventive music they'd ever heard. Enter Sgt. Pepper's. To help spark creativity, the band would often take acid during the writing sessions, and then go in to record once the ideas were thrown on paper. However, one day John Lennon couldn't keep track of his pills in the studio, which led to a bizarre studio hiccup. Thinking he had taken an upper, Lennon accidentally swallowed a hit of acid and began tripping midway through a take. Uninformed on the band's narcotic intake, producer George Martin had thought John had fallen ill, and decided to take him up to the roof to get some air. Martin's later account of the story recounts Lennon going on and on about the magnificence of the stars, along with meeting some of the members of up-and-comers Pink Floyd, while still flying. Though the album would go on to revolutionize modern music, the production was more unusual than anything the Beatles had worked on before. 4. Wish You Were Here, Pink Floyd. By the time Pink Floyd got around to making Wish You Were Here, much of the members were desensitized by the music industry. In addition to going through the ongoing tour cycle for Dark Side of the Moon, the band were also reflecting on the loss of founding member Syd Barrett years before. In an effort to reconnect with their fallen bandmate, the band made Wish You Were Here in tribute to Barrett, with Shine On You Crazy Diamond being the touchstone of the record. Though the sessions were already wrought with raw nerves, it got much more unusual when the band were paid a visit. Midway through recording, a large, bald man with a pale white complexion sauntered into the control room to watch the band work. What no one could have predicted was that this shell of a human being was Syd Barrett, who had come to check in on his former bandmates. After a few hours, Barrett left and went into a hermit-like seclusion for the remainder of his life. While the band were definitely happy to see their old friend, they were still deeply hurt by just how much of his creative spirit had withered away. Taking their pain and putting it into the songs, Floyd created what many consider to be the boldest critique of the music industry. 3. The Number of the Beast, Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden were on the cusp of something extraordinary by the time they hit their third record. Though The Number of the Beast became the album that launched them into the stratosphere, a near-fatal accident sent eerie alarm bells throughout the studio. While the initial recording sessions were going well, producer Martin Birch was involved in a car accident one night after tracking some of the songs. Birch was left relatively unscathed, but was horrified once he got the statement of the car's damages. Upon finishing the sessions for the title track, Birch got the bill with the ending balance reading a total of £666. Though claiming not to be superstitious, Birch did not want to take any chances and politely asked if the company could ring him up for £667 instead. After a few days of recuperation, Maiden got back into the studio and put the finishing touches on their metallic masterstroke. Though Satan may have come calling for their producer, no one was getting in the way of Maiden while under the watchful eye of Eddie. 2. Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Black Sabbath. From the time they started with their debut album, Black Sabbath seemed to be an unprecedented hard rock machine. With each passing record, it seemed like nothing could stop Tommy Iommi from coming up with the scariest riffs ever conceived. That is, until this record. Finally coming up empty, the band decided they needed to go off to write and set up shop in the famous Clearwell Castle, where bands like Deep Purple and Genesis had rehearsed. The initial start began in earnest as the Gothic architecture complemented Sabbath's sound to a T. When Iommi was scoping out the facilities with Ozzy Osbourne, the band found a cloaked figure walking the grounds, only to find that he'd disappeared into thin air. Upon consulting the grounds manager, the band was informed that it was just simply the castle's ghost. Clearly spooked by their mysterious visitor, the band quickly vacated the premises, but not before Iommi came up with the title track for their next record, whose riff revitalized Sabbath's heaviness instantaneously. So, next time you're feeling out of creative juice, try getting spooked by a ghost. Works every time. 1. The Downward Spiral, 9 Inch Nails. Trent Reznor had a whirlwind start to his career with his industrial outfit 9 Inch Nails. After coming off an impressive debut with Pretty Hate Machine, fans were itching to hear what was on the horizon for 9 Inch Nails. Looking to go even darker with his material, Reznor packed up his gear and moved into a house in the Hollywood Hills that he christened Le Pig, based on the word painted on the front door. What Reznor was unaware of at the time was that this location was where actress Sharon Tate was brutally murdered by Charles Manson's family. The Pig pig lettering that Reznor had noticed upon entering had actually been written by one of Manson's followers in Tate's blood. Undeterred by the more haunting aspects, Reznor used the dark history of the house as his fuel, as he filled the downward spiral with graphic soundscapes and visceral effects that made for one of the most intense listening experiences of the 90s.